Just turned 8 p.m. here in Moscow. I'm Kevin Owen. A warm welcome to you wherever you're watching around the world. First, the White House is set to overhaul its program. It seems to train so-called moderate rebels in Syria. Here's how the Pentagon Chief Ashton Carter explained the shift.
We have been looking for now several weeks at ways to improve that program. I wasn't satisfied with the early efforts in that regard, and so we're looking at different ways to achieve basically the same kind of strategic objective.
The ambitious goal was to prepare thousands of combat-ready troops. To achieve that, some $500 million was set aside from the budget. The results, though, fell far short of expectations, as RT's Lizzie Phelan reports.
Hugely ambitious program to train thousands of so-called moderate rebels, which the US often describes as the future of Syria. And their plan was to send these thousands of rebels trained and equipped into Syria to take on thousands of well-armed, well-trained, battle-hardened ISIS fighters. But as we've seen from this training program, they only managed to find a handful of these so-called moderates to go into Syria.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five. So.
How are you going to do it? Because I don't think it's been at all successful yet.
Many of those so-called moderate rebels ended up defecting to the extremists and handing over the weapons that they'd been given on that US training program to those extremists. Question is, while the US is claiming that the Russian campaign in Syria is essentially negatively affecting so-called moderate rebels, is where are these moderate rebels? Who are they? And if they're there, then why is the US abandoning this program?
From now on, the US will focus instead on providing arms and equipment to a select group of vetted Syrian rebels, according to a Pentagon spokesman. But back in June, the Pentagon chief himself admitted that it's proven quite a challenge finding these so-called moderate rebels at all.
We're trying to recruit and identify people that, as you put it, can be counted on to have the right mindset and ideology, not be aligned with groups like ISIL. It turns out to be very hard to identify people who meet both of those criteria.
This whole business about funding moderate rebels and so on has always been a bit of a fantasy, and that actually, I mean, there's nothing, for a number of reasons. In the first place, there's nothing moderate about what they're being trained to do. There's nothing moderate about forming a militia and then going and killing as many police and soldiers of a sovereign state as you can. And that's even assuming the best case scenario that they are only attacking police and soldiers, which even the Free Syrian Army, the so-called moderate rebels, are not. The Free Syrian Army celebrated their arrival in Aleppo, for example, by planting 2,000 kilo bombs in the middle of the city centre and looting the city's schools and so on. So this whole idea of moderate rebels was always a myth. I think it was always a way of channeling weapons actually into Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which are the more effective fighting groups on the ground. The weapons always inevitably end up, and this was widely predicted at the time, they would end up in the hands of these groups.
US officials have had a hard time talking about the disastrous results of that Syrian rebel training program.
The Department of Defense has been very candid in pointing out that this train and equip program for the moderate Syrian opposition has not, frankly, lived up to what we initially thought.
You say that this train and equip program hasn't lived up to expectations. That's an understatement, isn't it? I mean, when you first said you didn't challenge the assessment, are you talking about the assessment of Senator Ayotte, who said that that's a joke, or are you?
No, the total numbers of those trained for the program.